businessman's death mystifies friends and loved ones.
His death generated a lot of surprise. This was a very healthy, vibrant young man.
His blood glucose level was 21, which can cause your brain to swell.
But we knew Michael Cochran was not diabetic.
But to his investors, the timing is suspicious.
A lawyer approached me about an investment that he made just under $3 million.
He seems to think that there's something fishy going on with the company. People were giving up their entire retirement savings.
You're like, man, we just lost this money and we're never getting it back.
And when detectives uncover the truth, it exposes more than anyone could have anticipated.
In relatively short order, they were able to put together what was going on.
There was no business. It was just smoke and mirrors.
You're like, okay, this movie truly is playing out. This is true crime.
A second autopsy was able to rule his death a homicide.
Open the fridge, and there's a bottle of insulin sitting there.
How many of us that don't have diabetics have insulin in our refrigerators?
February 6, 2019. A woman named Natalie Cochran parks outside an emergency room in Beckley, West Virginia. With the help of a friend, she brings her unconscious husband, 38-year-old Michael Cochran, inside.
Michael had an unexplained medical event at the home. He had collapsed, and she had summoned some folks to come and help.
Initial testing showed that his blood glucose level was 21, which by all accounts is dire. In a healthy individual, that might be 60s, 70s. When a person's blood glucose drops below a certain level, you can go into a coma, and that can cause loss of oxygen to your brain. A very likely outcome is death.
Raleigh General took the appropriate medical action to raise that blood sugar level.
He is immediately intubated and put on the ventilator.
When doctors ask Natalie what might have caused this, she says she has no idea. Michael is an active father of two and the picture of health. But despite their efforts, Michael's condition continues to deteriorate.
Michael stayed on a ventilator from the time he was placed on one at Raleigh General Hospital until roughly 5 days later.
He was not waking up, no matter what sort of treatment he received to reverse the low blood sugar. And ultimately, he was declared brain dead.
For Natalie, that means it's time to consider the unthinkable.
She told us that they've done the MRI, he has no brain activity. She's got to make the decision to pull him off the vent.
Everyone comes in and says their goodbyes, and ultimately he is transferred to hospice, where he is for only a few hours before he passes away.
It was a bad day for everybody that knew Mike and loved Mike, and it just happened just so fast.
Michael's loved ones are devastated by the loss, but the way he died raises questions for several of them.
Michael's death generated a lot of surprise, again, because this was a very healthy, vibrant young man.
What happened here to, crush this young man's life that was just so full of life?
Michael Cochran was born in West Virginia on December 23, 1980.
Mike was raised by Donna, his mother, and Eddie, his stepfather. They are just wonderful people. Mike has always been into sports. He was always an athlete in high school. He played football. He played baseball.
Michael's interest in sports is what led him to meeting his future wife, Natalie.
Natalie worked at the sporting goods store, and Michael was always in there buying things.
Her mother and father were both in the school system there. He was an accountant, she was a school teacher. Had a pretty good life growing up, never really wanted for anything.
Soon after they began dating, it became clear they were meant for each other.
Every time you saw Mike, you saw Natalie. It's very seldom you've ever saw them apart.
She would always say we were high school sweethearts. And they went to WVU. She was planning to go to pharmacy school, and he was doing computer science, IT work. And they got engaged while they were at college. They married young. After they finished school, they settled in Daniels, West Virginia, and they had 2 kids.
Mike, as a father, he was very, very into his children. He was always coaching his son in football there. His daughter was always there with him as well.
Michael and Natalie both worked hard to support their family.
Michael owned an IT company. He installed computer programs for different offices. Natalie was a pharmacist, and she worked at various retail pharmacies in the area.
They built a comfortable life together, but had their sights set on something bigger.
In 2017, Michael and Natalie formed a company, Tactical Solutions Group. And the stated purpose of the company was to deal in government contracts. People that got those government contracts would make money by buying and selling them.
They would make a purchase, and they would get paid back from the government.
Michael would research available government contracts, but Natalie was the point person for the company. She was the one that got the money. When people would come to Michael, he would refer them to Natalie.
Michael said that Natalie was the one that had gotten that business going, and she knew everything.
The Cochrans found most of their investors right there in Beckley.
We did small amounts over a period of time. We didn't do a lump sum because I was unsure about how this was working and how it was going on. In time, it was around $17,000 total.
And by all appearances, business was booming.
They were purchasing houses, they were purchasing cars, they were purchasing land. They were going on vacations.
The Cochrans were coming into quite a lot of money, and they were coming into it pretty quickly.
They seemed to be doing great, and they had everything.
Now, Michael has unexpectedly passed away, and his loved ones want to know why. Despite the unusual nature of his death, doctors attribute it to a natural medical episode.
Michael was, by all accounts, very healthy. It was very strange that Michael passed away so suddenly, but when a person passes away in hospice care, there's not typically seen to be an emergent need for an autopsy. His cause of death was explained as respiratory failure and having to do with an anoxic brain injury.
A month later, reports are trickling in that the Cochrans' business may not be all that it seems.
A lawyer in Beckley had approached me about an investment that he'd made with Natalie Cochran. He was concerned that he wasn't going to receive his money back.
There was a local business owner who came forward to another trooper kind of in confidence. He had entered into a business agreement with Natalie Cochran, and he was, I guess to say, at the end of his rope.
He had previously contacted Natalie. He seems to think that there's something fishy going on with the company.
He was more or less looking to either get her to complete the deal that he had entered into with the business with her, or return his money that he had invested, which was approximately $40,000. Around the time that this transaction was supposed to be completed, Michael Cochran also suddenly died.
When police begin researching Tactical Solutions Group, They find several other investors in Beckley who are wondering what happened to their money.
People were giving up their entire retirement, thinking they're going to be making hundreds of thousands of dollars in return.
There were all sorts of excuses as to why those promises couldn't be fulfilled. Natalie would blame the bank for not transferring the money as promised.
To seasoned detectives, Natalie's excuses sound like something else.
We could not find any record of any government contract that the TSG business had ever engaged in.
She's been orchestrating this multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme right here at home.
A Ponzi scheme is, in basic terms, is when they take the second person's money, give it back to the first person, part of it, and then they continue on down the line collecting money from all these people, but eventually the money's going to run out.
And the timing is suspicious.
The death of Michael, in the midst of what was clearly a fraud being perpetrated by Natalie, had to raise some major suspicions.
Michael Cochran was a very healthy, fit, 38-year-old young man. For a person like Michael Cochran to just suddenly die, yeah, that warrants a second look.
And so the investigation also pursued the potential unlawful death of Michael.
She was running this Ponzi scheme, and then her husband dies. And it all just seems a little too convenient. They realized they had to talk to Natalie about it.
Coming up, friends paint a puzzling picture.
She said he will not go to the hospital. And he would be so mad if he woke up and he was there.
But Natalie tells investigators she thinks his death was caused by a bodybuilding obsession.
He would take 34 supplements a day. It even came in a bottle that said for animal use only, not for human ingestion.
West Virginia State Police are dealing with two possible crimes: the mysterious death of 38-year-old Michael Cochran and the alleged Ponzi scheme his wife Natalie Cochran has been accused of running. Right now, it's unclear if there's a connection.
There's unaccounted money out there. The investors are upset. I think ultimately there was the loss to the investors just under $3 million.
The FBI is tasked with handling the financial crime, while detectives focus on the possible homicide. They begin by speaking with the Cochrans' long-term friends and investors, John and Stephanie Hamilton, who say this is the second tragedy to befall the family.
Right around the time frame that I gave her the first check for the investment in January of 2019. That same week, actually, she told me that she had leukemia. I was devastated for her. She's young, we're the same age, and she's got young kids.
Everybody was just trying to just do everything they could for her because no one wants to battle cancer alone.
I immediately was, how can I help them? What can we do?
The Hamiltons were so focused on Natalie's health that it came as a surprise when a month later she called to say that Michael had fallen sick as well.
On February 6th that morning, Natalie had sent me a text saying that Mike had collapsed and just wanted to know if I could come by. Whenever I got there, Mike was laying on their downstairs couch and appeared to be asleep. I asked Natalie what had happened, and she said that he had a seizure and that she was going to let him sleep it off. I said, do you want me to call him an ambulance? Do you want us to drive him to the hospital? And she said, well, no, I'm just going to let him sleep it off. This is what he does whenever he has seizures. You know, you're thinking, well, I really don't think this is the best idea, but it's her husband. So what I did was I went and I called my wife, because my wife is a physician assistant.
I said, you know, what's wrong? And he said, Michael's sick. And I said, okay. And he said, you need to stop by here and see if you can talk her into taking him to the hospital. When I get to the house, I walk in and Michael's laying on the couch and there's a blood pressure cuff on his arm. And I remember seeing the numbers and the heart rate, and that was all good. And I said, what happened? And she said, well, he was throwing up in the sink. He had a seizure. Anybody that has a history of seizures should go to the hospital immediately. She said he will not go to the hospital. And she said he would be so mad if he woke up and he was there. I said, well, blame me. Tell him I was here. I said he had to go. And she said, well, I'm just gonna let him sleep it off. I had to leave. So I left, and she had promised when I was leaving, if he didn't wake up from his sleep, that she would take him to the hospital.
I know that Steph, throughout the day, she was getting updates on how Mike was. At one point, Natalie actually showed my wife a photo of the way that he had been laying in the kitchen. And my wife once again reiterated that, you know, Natalie, you probably need to take him to the hospital just to get him checked, just to be sure.
The Hamiltons say 8 hours after she initially called them, Natalie texted that she was taking Michael to the ER.
Their friend and neighbor come by and actually got Mike to the hospital that night there. He was the only one that could talk her into it finally.
She did let me know they got there. They were working on him. The next thing I get is a picture of him on the vent and everything. And I thought, what in the world is going on?
To homicide investigators, the fact that Natalie waited so long to get her husband medical attention is a potential red flag.
Clearly, he was in distress, and she didn't get him help when everybody could see that he needed help.
As we talked to all these witnesses, I was like, man, it seems like that she was delaying care for him. Well, why would you do that? Then your gut just sinks because you're thinking, man, that's pretty cold-blooded.
With questions regarding the sudden death of Michael Cochran continuing to arise, detectives are left wondering why an autopsy was not performed.
It's very unusual for someone to die in hospice care and have an autopsy. That's where people go to die with as much comfort for them and their survivors as they can. So that was certainly not unusual that there was no autopsy at the time. But the investigation into the fraud aspect meshed with the suspicious death of a very healthy young man.
The death certificate listed Michael's death as natural causes. That is obviously a hurdle, but it's not insurmountable. It doesn't mean that we're going to stop doing what we're doing.
But it did take a really long time from the time that Michael died in February of 2019 to gather evidence. There was so much talk in the community about his death. So our office kept the information that did not need to be public behind closed doors. At this point, Lieutenant Bledsoe needs to know what Natalie knows about Michael's death.
And she offered to come into the state police detachment.
On April 8th, 2 months after her husband died, Natalie speaks to investigators in West Virginia.
Like I told you, we're investigating, what caused or contributed to Michael's death.
Natalie, just tell me just how things progressed, with Michael.
So, in November, he got sick. We thought he had toxic exposure to mold.
Okay.
They ran all these tests and they said he had a brain tumor. And then they did an MRI and said, well, no, it's not a tumor. There's something else going on, but we're not sure what. So a few days go by and they say, well, we think it's just seizures. So they started him on treatment medicine, and it took several weeks for him to fully get better. And Mike was very adamant after he got out of the hospital last time. He said, if you ever take me to the hospital again, you're going to be dead. That was a waste of money and a waste of time.
Natalie says she doesn't think Michael's death had anything to do with the seizures. She's convinced it was caused by something else.
She stated that after Michael had passed away, she found this bottle in a medicine cabinet, which was labeled as enclomiphene citrate. She didn't know what it was. She said he got it on a trip to Mexico.
During that time, he paid 34 supplements a day. He was bodybuilder.
Okay.
I'd always been on him, like, this stuff's not safe, it's not tested. It even came in a bottle that said for animal use only, not for human ingestion. And he was taking it, like a steroid.
Right.
He was taking it to gain mass and to see his stuff cut up.
Gotcha.
And it also had an insulin component in it, which bodybuilders can manipulate insulin to cut muscle. And so Mike was all about, like, all that stuff.
Michael was very athletic. He lifted weights, he ran. He took some supplements, but mainly just what seemed to be your normal supplements that healthy people take.
She says that Michael definitely overdosed on this alleged Mexican supplement that he was using as part of his workout regimen.
Hospital records seem to confirm Natalie's theory.
When Michael got to the Raleigh General Emergency Room, they took a sample of his blood, and his blood glucose level was 21, which is essentially fatal.
I want to see exactly what the effects are of an insulin overdose on a non-diabetic patient, because we knew Michael Cochran was not diabetic.
They discover that unnecessary insulin intake can cause loss of brain function and comas.
The first attending physician that we interviewed, I asked him, can you even overdose from insulin? He said, oh yeah, absolutely. He said, if you let it go unattended, he said, after a certain time, it becomes irreversible.
There was a substance that she said he used, which was enclomiphene citrate. However, experts were able to determine that there's no evidence that that could have caused Michael's condition, even if he was using it.
It was a substance that would certainly not be fatal, and certainly would not cause Michael Cochran to have a hypoglycemic injury.
Investigators find it unlikely that, as a medical professional herself, Natalie would make such a mistake.
At this point in the investigation, Mike's death hasn't even been ruled a homicide. We have no idea what killed him, and we have no murder weapon at this point. And then Natalie brings up the idea of insulin for bodybuilding purposes.
Natalie Cochran is a diabetic educator, a pharmacist whose specialty is treating people who have diabetes. Who would know it better? And more importantly, not just know it, but who would know how long that it takes?
Police wonder if they've just been told how Michael was killed by the person who did it.
We knew we had turned over the right stone. It's just now follow the evidence.
Coming up, the government's fraud case reaches a conclusion.
They found a contract where Natalie had arranged to sell half of the business.
But investigators find the homicide trickier to prove.
There is no per se smoking gun. So you're looking at why did this happen?
Three months into the investigation of Michael Cochran's death, West Virginia police decide to prioritize getting an arrest for the Ponzi scheme, so they ask federal agents pursuing the fraud allegations for assistance.
The officers that executed the search warrant were state police, ATF, and the FBI, all engaged as a collaborative search.
They're looking for any number of things that could support the theory that there was a Ponzi scheme. They're seizing papers, they're seizing electronics.
There were deposits being made, but the payments coming out were all from those deposits of investors and none from any true generation of business. They found a contract in that search warrant where Natalie had arranged to sell half of the business to a local business person for a significant amount of money.
They were going to pay $4.9 million for a business that was absolutely worthless. There was no business. It was just smoke and mirrors.
The contract proves to federal investigators that Natalie knew the scheme couldn't last forever.
She was going to sell it to someone else and have them take the fall for her. And then she would have been out of it. She would have been free and clear.
But homicide detectives are looking for something else, a murder weapon.
Open the fridge. In the door, there were shelves, and there was a stack of candy bars. I moved those out of the way, and when I did, there was this bottle of insulin sitting there.
There was a single puncture. Someone had stuck a needle in that bottle and extracted some quantity of insulin out of it.
At this point in the case, it's really significant that investigators are able to find a bottle of insulin in the Cochran residence. One, because no one in the residence is diabetic, so there's really no reason for insulin to be there. Two, in her interview with Lieutenant Bledsoe, Natalie has brought up the idea of insulin use.
You just can't believe that someone who is not a diabetic does not use insulin because it could put you in a diabetic shock.
How many of us that don't have diabetics have insulin in our refrigerators? Not many, I dare say. Whenever the officers execute a search warrant, they're required by law to give the owner a receipt.
She gets to the insulin, and she's packing the paper. She says, "This right here, this is for a neighbor's child who has diabetes, and I keep that insulin here for him."
Why pick out that one thing? That's going to get any competent investigator. That's going to get his attention.
When investigators ask the neighbor whether she gave Natalie the insulin, she says she did, but not for the reason Natalie claimed.
The morning that Mike gets sick, Natalie texts her friend and neighbor and tells her that she is going to have to start taking small shots of insulin to regulate her blood sugar because it's been elevated due to her cancer treatments. And around 10:30 that morning, he actually drops the insulin off at the Cochran residence. We obtained Natalie's medical records from the places that she said she was getting treatment for her leukemia. And there was never any indication that she had received treatment for any kind of cancer.
Who lies about that? You know, if you're capable of lying about that, is it hard to believe that you're capable of killing your husband?
Natalie asked for a bottle of insulin the morning that Mike gets sick, and suddenly his blood sugar is 21. So they're really starting to get a clearer image of who Natalie Cochran is at this point.
But to prosecute Natalie for murder, they first need to prove Michael's death was a homicide. In September, 7 months after Michael's death, police obtain a court order to exhume his body.
He undergoes his first autopsy. At that point, Michael was already pretty severely decayed. his cause and manner of death were ruled undetermined and undeterminable.
That autopsy had no forensic value whatsoever. It didn't enlighten anybody as to anything.
For now, the only thing Natalie can be charged with is financial crime.
A couple weeks after Michael's autopsy occurs, Natalie Cochran is arrested on 26 federal counts of wire fraud and money laundering.
I called Bledsoe, the Detective Bledsoe. I said, someone told me this is a Ponzi scheme. Is this true? And he says, yeah, I'm afraid it's true.
You're like, man, it's like we just lost this money. We're never getting it back.
It's devastating. And not just about the money, but the betrayal was so deep. That level of betrayal, that was much deeper than the money.
When Natalie was finally arrested towards the end of September, what ran through my mind is that she finally was going to get what she deserved.
Homicide investigators are finding it difficult to build a case against Natalie Cochran, but the federal crimes she's been charged with eventually lead to jail time.
About a year after her initial arrest for the money laundering and wire fraud charges, Natalie Cochran actually pled guilty to some of those charges and was sentenced to 11 years in the federal penitentiary.
The federal Ponzi scheme side of it, that's pretty easy. There's tons of evidence as to what transpired here. The murder was the hard part. When you look at circumstantial cases, there is no per se smoking gun. So you're looking at, why did this happen?
People don't just get up out of bed and decide to murder their spouse.
Believing Natalie's motive is the key to cracking the case, detectives search her phone, which was seized during the federal fraud investigation.
Natalie's phone contains thousands of text message exchanges, emails, all really showing she was not only telling investors certain excuses and explanations for why they're not getting their money, but that she's also telling Michael the same things.
That also applied between Michael and Natalie. I read about 1,600 pages that covered about an 18-month time period, and she was telling Michael the exact same lies she was telling the investors. There was no evidence that Michael knew about the Ponzi scheme. He really thought they had a successful business going, and they had banker problems.
But it seems Michael slowly began to realize something was wrong. Speaking to bank officials, police learned that he asked for a full accounting from them in February 2019.
The night before Michael collapsed, he was getting so outraged that the money was not coming because Natalie had been telling him that they have hundreds of millions of dollars. So Michael's going to straighten this out, and he directs Natalie to arrange to fly down to the local branch in Virginia that Michael thinks is stopping up the money supply to their investors.
She and Michael were supposed to take a flight the morning of February 6th in order to determine why money was not hitting their bank account.
Had that flight taken place and the Cochrans talked to the banker, Michael would know this whole thing is a fraud. And at that point, the Ponzi scheme ends. Natalie could never let that happen. She had to do anything she could to prevent the meeting.
She was a cornered animal. That's exactly what she was.
It's not crystal clear as to what plane they were going to take, but they did have one available. At 6:30 in the morning on the day that Michael collapses, Natalie texts the pilot and says she's been up all night, she's sick, She can't go. They'll have to reschedule. So the flight is off.
She snapped. She called that day to get the insulin.
Police know that the insulin was dropped off by 10:30 a.m.
Natalie's weapon of choice was insulin. She was a pharmacist by training and trade, so she knew exactly what she was doing. Circumstantially, there's only one explanation for why Michael Cochran died.
Throughout the day, while Michael's unconscious on the couch, Natalie is sending some of his vital signs via text message to friends, sending his purported blood glucose levels. The numbers that she was sending were always high. And given what we know now and how low his blood sugar was when he actually got treatment, those couldn't have been accurate.
Once you hit blood glucose level that low, the effects become more and more irreversible as time goes by. He had laid there for about 8 hours, and there was no indicator that she had any intentions on letting him go anywhere other than that couch until her friend showed up. She would have let him lay there till he died.
In May 2021, 2 years and 3 months after Michael's death, investigators pay Natalie a visit in federal prison and give her a chance to come clean.
Obviously, we've been conducting an investigation into Michael's death for some time now. And, we're bringing that to a conclusion.
I did not do anything to him. I feel like I've led enough for the two of us already. Because I took the fall for something that he was responsible for too.
That's not true.
It's true.
In November 2021, 6 months into her prison term, Natalie Cochran is indicted again, this time for murder. But prosecutors are concerned they won't be able to convince a jury of her guilt without more evidence.
The street wisdom was we were going to get our butts kicked, and this should never go to trial. Why are we wasting our time? And it's because of the lack of the usual indicators in a murder case. The medical examiner never reached a conclusion that there was a homicide.
A second autopsy is ordered by the former prosecutor. This pathologist also had the benefit of reviewing all of Michael's medical records. And from both those records, his review of the initial autopsy report and his own autopsy, he was able to rule Michael's death a homicide and that he had been killed by someone else giving him insulin. Having that conclusive finding, I think that really sealed the deal and gave us what we needed to prosecute her.
In January 2025, 5 years and 11 months after the death of Michael Cochran, his wife Natalie Cochran goes on trial. Prosecutors are now armed with the results of the second autopsy, but know the process may be an uphill battle.
There were a number of events that transpired between the time that Michael died and the time that we were actually able to try this case. There was definitely a lot of moving parts, but I think ultimately this was tried when it was meant to be tried. During the trial, Natalie is very smug. Honestly, I think she is convinced that no jury is going to find her guilty.
I could hear her constantly talking to her lawyers. At every time out where you could see what she was doing, she was writing them notes and passing them to them. This was the Natalie Cochran show.
The prosecution's case against Natalie remains largely circumstantial.
A jury pool anywhere are so used to seeing on television direct evidence. They're used to seeing DNA evidence, and in a case like this, there would be no way for us to have any of that.
But instead of attacking the state's lack of physical evidence, Natalie's attorneys take a different approach.
The defense in this case was somewhat schizophrenic. One of the defenses was she couldn't have injected him because he would just fight her off. Simultaneously, they said Michael Cochran was this sickly guy. He had so many medical problems. Hell, he was going to die any minute anyhow. So his death shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. I mean, it was defense du jour, and the trial went on for 3 weeks.
Surprisingly, Natalie never takes the stand in her own defense. When the jury is sent to deliberate, it only takes them 2 hours to reach a decision.
The judge receives the verdict from the jury foreperson, and he says, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Natalie Cochran, guilty of first-degree murder."
Natalie Cochran is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Nothing will ever bring back Michael, but the jury spoke for him. And it was just, it was kind of like a sigh of relief, like evil lost and the truth won. And that's how I felt.
There's always going to be that certain scar there, but everybody's just trying to get their head up and go on and move on about their lives.
I used to trust everyone, and I always thought, and I still think, everyone has a good side. They're good in everyone. But I'm not so trusting anymore. To keep Michael's memory alive, we try to get his story out, just what we're doing here. He deserves to be remembered.
The desert remembers everything. Not in words, not in memories anyone can touch, but in the way the wind never stops moving, in the way the sand shifts just enough to hide what should never be found, in the way silence stretches longer out here than it should. October 1985, northern Arizona. A stretch of highway so empty it feels unfinished, like the world forgot to build anything beyond it.
No streetlights.
No houses, just darkness and distance. At 2:17 in the morning, a passing truck driver slows down. Something isn't right. A sedan sits crooked on the shoulder, angled just enough to suggest it didn't stop on purpose. Headlights still on. Engine humming. Driver's door open wide, creaking slightly as the wind pushes against it. He pulls over.
Calls it in.
By the time the first patrol unit arrives, the air feels wrong. Not dangerous. Not loud. Just off. The kind of wrong that doesn't show itself, but sits there, waiting to be noticed. The car is still running. Radio whispering static. Keys in the ignition. No driver.
No passenger.
No one. Inside, the scene freezes like a photograph. A purse rests on the passenger seat, half open. Lipstick, receipts, a folded note. Everything spilled but nothing taken. Wallet untouched. Cash still inside. No signs of panic. No broken glass. No blood. Just absence. The name comes in minutes later. Laura Bennett, 26, elementary school teacher. No criminal record. No known enemies. No history of disappearing, not even for an hour without telling someone. She had been at a birthday dinner earlier that night, left just before midnight, smiled, said she was tired, said she'd call in the morning. She never did. By sunrise, the scene is locked down. Yellow tape cuts through the desert like a warning line no one can cross. Detectives move slowly, carefully, as if one wrong step might erase something important.
But there's almost nothing there.
No footprints in the sand leading away from the car. Just wind-swept ground that looks untouched. No tire tracks beyond her own.
No debris. No struggle.
It's too clean. Too quiet. Too deliberate. They check the obvious first. Was it a breakdown?
No.
The car is fine. Was it a voluntary stop? Maybe. But then where did she go? Why leave the door open? Why leave everything behind? And why does it feel staged? One detail stands out. Small, easy to miss. The driver's seat. It's pushed back farther than it should be. Laura was not tall. Friends confirm it. Family confirms it. She always kept the seat close to the wheel. But now it shifted. Just a few inches. Not dramatic, but enough to matter. Enough to suggest someone else had been there. Someone bigger. Someone who adjusted it. Someone who drove or sat or waited. The tone of the investigation changes instantly. This is no longer a missing person case. This is something else. Something darker. Crime scene technicians begin their slow, methodical work.
Brushes, powders, bags, tucks.
Every inch of the car becomes evidence. Every surface, a potential voice waiting to speak. They find fingerprints. Partial, smudged, useless for identification with the technology of the time. They collect fibers.
Dust.
Fragments that might mean everything or nothing. And then something almost invisible. A single strand of hair. Caught on the back seat fabric. Not Laura's. Different color. Slightly longer. Almost overlooked. They bag it carefully. Label it.
Store it.
In 1985, it's just another detail. Another piece of a puzzle that has no clear picture. By midday, the news spreads. Woman missing. Suspicious vehicle found. Possible abduction. The words hit the community like a shockwave. Flagstaff isn't built for this kind of story. People know each other here. They recognize cars. They wave at strangers. They trust the quiet. But now the quiet feels different.
Heavier.
Neighbors gather in driveways, voices low, glancing toward the highway as if it might answer them. Doors are locked earlier that night. Curtains stay closed. Something has broken. And no one knows what it is. Detectives retrace Laura's last known hours. The restaurant. The parking lot. The route she would have taken home. They speak to everyone. Co-workers. Waiters. Friends who sat at the same table. Nothing stands out.
No argument.
No strange calls. No one following her. She left alone. She always did. But somewhere between that restaurant and that empty stretch of road something changed. Something interrupted the ordinary. A gas station clerk thinks he might have seen her car. A man reports headlights pulled over on the side of the road. A woman claims she heard something late at night, but isn't sure what. Every tip is logged. Every lead followed. None of them hold. Days pass. Search teams move into the desert. Volunteers line up shoulder to shoulder, walking slowly across open land, scanning the ground for anything out of place. Helicopters sweep overhead, blades cutting through the silence, eyes searching for shapes that shouldn't be there. Nothing. No body.
No clothing.
No sign she ever left that car. It's as if she dissolved into the air. And then the first real crack appears. A waitress from a late-night diner comes forward. She hesitates at first, unsure, afraid of being wrong, but something about the news coverage pulls at her memory. She remembers a woman. Alone.
Late.
Sitting at a corner table. Quiet. Watching the door. The description matches Laura. Perfectly. The time fits. Roughly an hour before the car was found. Detectives lean in. Ask her to go slower. Tell them everything. She remembers the way the woman held her cup. Both hands.
Tight.
Like she was cold. Or nervous. She remembers how often she looked toward the entrance. And then the man. He walked in without hesitation.
Tall. Broad.
Wearing a dark jacket that didn't match the desert warmth. He didn't look around.
Didn't hesitate.
Walked straight to her table. Sat down.
They spoke.
Quietly. Too quietly. But the waitress noticed something. Not what they said. How they said it. There was tension. A stillness. Like both of them understood something no one else could hear. Minutes passed. Maybe 5, maybe 10. Then they stood up. Together. The woman didn't resist. Didn't smile either. She just followed. The man placed his hand lightly on her arm. Not aggressive. Not forceful. But not optional. Controlled. That's the word the waitress repeats. Controlled. Detectives write it down. Underline it. Circle it. Because that word changes everything. Now there is a face. A presence. A moment where Laura was not alone. They create a sketch. Release it to the public. Newspapers print it across front pages. Local stations broadcast it between urgent headlines.
Calls flood in.
I've seen him. I know someone who looks like that. Could be a drifter. A trucker. A traveler passing through. Each lead is chased. Each name investigated. Each possibility explored. And one by one they collapse. Nothing sticks. The man remains unidentified. A shadow without a name. Weeks turn into months. The story fades from headlines. Replaced by new events. New fears. New distractions. But for Laura's family, nothing moves on. Her parents keep searching. Keep asking.
Keep hoping.
They print flyers until their hands shake. Stand on corners. Speak into microphones. Someone knows. Someone saw. Please. But the desert doesn't answer. And neither does anyone else. Inside the police department, the case slows. Files grow thicker. Leads grow thinner. Detectives are reassigned. New cases arrive. Urgent ones. Solvable ones. This one lingers. Every so often, someone opens the file. Looks again. The car. The empty road. The open door. The untouched purse. And that single strand of hair. Waiting. Always waiting. Because evidence doesn't disappear. It waits for the world to catch up. And somewhere in that silence buried under years of dust and time, the truth is still there. Unseen. Unspoken. Unfinished. Time doesn't heal a case like this. It hardens it. It presses every unanswered question deeper into the file, into the minds of the people who refuse to forget, into the quiet corners of a town that learned too quickly how fragile normal life really is. By early 1986, the investigation is no longer loud. No more daily updates. No more headlines screaming across front pages. Just a slow, grinding persistence behind closed doors. Detectives revisit everything. Again. And again. Because when nothing makes sense, you start from the beginning, and then you start again. They map Laura Bennett's final known movements down to the minute. The dinner.
The drive.
The diner. The man. The highway. Every second accounted for, except the ones that matter most. The gap between the diner and the abandoned car becomes the center of everything. What happened in that space? What changed? Why did she leave her vehicle running? Why did she step out? Or was she forced? The theories begin to split. One group believes she knew him. Someone familiar. Someone she trusted enough to stop for. The other believes the opposite. A calculated stranger. Someone who knew how to approach without raising alarm. Someone practiced. Someone patient. Both possibilities are equally disturbing. Both lead nowhere. The diner becomes a focal point. Detectives return. Recreate the scene. Sit in the same booths. Watch the door. Try to feel what the waitress felt. But memory is fragile. Details blur. Confidence fades. The waitress repeats her statement, but each time it shifts slightly. Not in meaning. In certainty. Was his jacket black or dark blue? Was his hair short or just combed back? Did Laura look afraid or just tense? No one can say for sure anymore. And that uncertainty spreads. Because in a case with no body, no witnesses, no clear evidence, small details become everything. And when they weaken, the whole case begins to slip. They widen the search. Check missing persons databases. Compare unsolved cases across Arizona. Then beyond. Nevada. New Mexico. California.
Patterns.
They look for patterns. Young women. Highways. Late at night. Vehicles left behind. But nothing lines up perfectly. Just similarities. Fragments. Possibilities that almost connect, but never quite do. Meanwhile, the forensic evidence sits untouched. Not ignored. Just limited. The fingerprints, partial, incomplete, are run through every available system. No matches. The fibers, generic, common, offer nothing specific. And the hair. That single strand. It becomes both the most important piece and the most frustrating. In 1986, hair can suggest color, texture, possible origin. But it cannot identify. Not definitively. Not in a way that names a person. So it waits.
Sealed.
Catalogued.
Silent.
As the months stretch into a year, the investigation reaches its first real wall.
No suspect. No confession. No breakthrough.
Just a growing sense that whoever did this planned it well. Too well. The idea begins to settle in. This wasn't random. This wasn't messy. This wasn't a moment of chaos. It was controlled. That word again. Controlled. The same word the waitress used. The same feeling that lingers over every piece of evidence. A man who walks into a diner, sits down without hesitation, leaves without drawing attention. A car abandoned without signs of struggle. A disappearance without noise. Everything points to someone who understood risk. Understood timing. Understood how to leave nothing behind. And that realization changes the tone of the case. Because now they're not just looking for someone who committed a crime. They're looking for someone who knows how not to be caught. 1987. The file grows thicker. Tips still come in, but fewer now. Most are repeats. Old names. Old suspicions. People trying to make sense of something that refuses to be solved. Detectives begin to revisit individuals connected to Laura. Friends. Co-workers. Family acquaintances. Anyone who might have crossed her path. They ask different questions this time. Not just, where were you? But who did she trust? Who knew her routines? Who knew she would be alone that night? Patterns of behavior. Subtle connections. But again, nothing breaks. No one stands out. No one fits. Her life, by all accounts, was ordinary, structured, safe. And that's what makes the case harder. Because crimes like this often leave a trail, a history, warning signs. But here there is nothing. Just a clean break from normal into silence. By 1988, the case is officially labeled what no family ever wants to hear. Cold case. Two words that sound simple, but carry weight. Finality. A quiet admission that, for now, the answers are out of reach. The file is moved. Not closed. Never closed. But no longer active. No longer urgent. It sits on a shelf among others like it. Rows of unresolved stories. Faces that stare out from photographs, waiting. Hoping. Forgotten by most. But not all. Laura's parents continue. They don't stop. They can't. Birthdays pass. Holidays come and go. Her room remains the same. Clothes untouched. Books exactly where she left them. Because moving them would mean accepting something they refuse to accept. That she's gone. Without explanation. Without justice. The years continue. 1989. 1990. 1991. The world changes. Technology advances. DNA science begins to emerge. Slowly at first. Then faster. Cases once thought impossible start to crack. Evidence that sat silent for years begins to speak. But not this one. Not yet. Because no one has gone back to that shelf.
No one has reopened that box.
No one has taken out that single strand of hair and asked it the question it's been waiting decades to answer.
Instead, it waits.
In darkness. In storage. In a system that isn't ready yet. But outside, something else is happening. Unnoticed. Unconnected. At least at first. Reports begin to surface in other states. Similar. Not identical. But similar enough to raise quiet concern among a few who pay attention.
Vehicles abandonat.
Late-night encounters. Women last seen with unidentified men.
No bodies. No suspects.
Just absence. Just silence. But in the late 80s and early 90s, information doesn't travel the way it does now. Cases remain local. Details stay contained. Connections that might exist remain hidden. And so each case lives alone. Each mystery isolated. Each victim a separate story. Even if they aren't. Back in Arizona, the desert continues its quiet watch. Highways stretch endlessly. Cars pass through without stopping.
People move on.
New families arrive. Old ones leave. And the place where Laura's car was found becomes just another stretch of road.
No marker.
No sign. Nothing to indicate what happened there. Except for those who remember. And those who refuse to forget. Inside the evidence room, the box remains untouched. Label faded slightly. Tape still sealed. Inside, the fragments of a moment frozen in time. Fingerprints that couldn't speak. Fibers that couldn't point. And that hair. Still waiting. Because evidence doesn't lose its truth. Only our ability to hear it changes. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of 1985, beyond the limits of what detectives could do back then, a future exists where that silence breaks. Where the smallest detail becomes the loudest voice. Where decades of waiting collapse into a single revelation. But in this moment, in these years, no one knows that yet. All they know is this. A woman vanished. A car was left behind. A man walked into a diner and out again without a name. And the desert kept everything else. By the early 1990s, the case isn't dead. It's sleeping. Buried under newer files, louder crimes, fresher evidence that demands immediate attention. But beneath the dust, beneath the routine of a system that has learned to move on, the Bennett file remains intact, heavy, unresolved, quietly resisting closure. Every few months, someone opens it. Not out of obligation. Out of instinct. A detective flipping through old photographs late at night. A supervisor reviewing unsolved cases during a slow shift. A new recruit drawn to the mystery, convinced they might see something others missed. They all start the same way. The car. The open door. The untouched purse. The silence. And then the questions begin again. What if she didn't stop voluntarily? What if the encounter at the diner wasn't the beginning but the continuation of something already in motion? The timeline becomes the obsession. From the moment Laura Bennett leaves the restaurant to the moment her car is found, every minute is dissected, stretched, re-examined. Distances are measured. Speeds calculated. Possibilities mapped out on paper, on walls, in minds that refuse to accept the gap as unsolvable. Could someone have followed her from the dinner? Unlikely.
No witnesses.
No reports of a trailing vehicle. Could the man from the diner have intercepted her later? Possible. But how did he know where she would go? Unless he already knew. That idea begins to settle deeper than the others. Not a random encounter. Not coincidence. But intention. Because the way he approached her, direct, confident, without hesitation, it suggests familiarity. Not necessarily personal, but informational. As if he knew enough about her to act without fear of resistance. Detectives begin looking at Laura's life again. More carefully this time. Less focused on obvious connections. More on the subtle ones. Routine. Patterns. Predictability. She left work at the same time every day. Drove the same routes. Shopped at the same stores. Visited the same places. A life built on consistency. Safe until it wasn't. Someone watching from a distance could have learned everything. Her schedule. Her habits. Her comfort zones. And once you know those things, you don't need to know the person. You just need the moment. This theory shifts the investigation in a new direction.
Surveillance.
Not in the modern sense, no cameras, no digital footprints, but human observation. Who worked near her? Who lived along her route? Who had access to her environment without being noticed? Names are pulled. Lists created. Dozens at first. Then hundreds. Maintenance workers. Delivery drivers. Neighbors. Former co-workers. Anyone who could blend into the background. Interviews begin again. Quiet. Routine. Often repetitive. Did you know Laura Bennett? Did you ever see her outside of work? Do you remember anything unusual in October 1985? Most answers are the same.
No. No. No.
But occasionally there's hesitation. A pause just long enough to matter. A detail that doesn't quite fit. A memory that surfaces slowly, reluctantly. One man remembers seeing a vehicle parked near Laura's apartment building more than once. Not unusual on its own. But it was always there at odd hours. Late at night. Early morning. Engine off.
Lights out.
Just sitting. He never reported it. Never thought it mattered. Now it does. Detectives try to identify the vehicle. Too late. No license plate recorded. No clear description beyond, dark-colored sedan. Another ghost. Another shadow. But it reinforces the theory. Someone could have been watching, waiting,
learning.
and when the time came, acting. Meanwhile, forensic science inches forward. Not fast enough to reopen every case. Not powerful enough to solve everything. But enough to change the conversation. DNA begins to appear in headlines. Convictions based on biological evidence. Cold cases reopening. Names finally attached to crimes that had none. Inside the department, the idea circulates quietly. Could the Bennett case benefit from this? Could that single strand of hair finally mean something? The evidence is retrieved.
Carefully.
After years in storage, the packaging is opened. The contents examined again. The hair is still there. Unchanged.
Preserved.
Waiting. But the technology isn't quite ready. Not yet. Early DNA testing requires more material. Cleaner samples. Clearer origins. This might not be enough. Still, it's noted. Documented. Flagged for the future. Because the future is coming. And when it arrives, this will matter. Mid-1990s. The case sees a brief resurgence. A new detective takes interest. Fresh perspective. Less attached to old assumptions. He approaches it differently. Less focused on what is known. More on what feels wrong. The diner interaction. It bothers him. Not the existence of the man, but the behavior. Controlled.
Calm.
Confident. That's not desperation. That's not impulse. That's experience. He begins to wonder. What if this wasn't the first time? The idea spreads quietly. What if Laura Bennett wasn't the only one? They revisit other cases. Not just in Arizona, but beyond. Pull files from neighboring states. Look for patterns again. This time with a different lens. Not identical details, but behavioral similarities. Approach. Timing. Control. They find fragments. A woman in Nevada who disappeared after stopping at a roadside cafe. Another in New Mexico last seen speaking to an unidentified man before vanishing.
No bodies. No suspects.
Just absence. Just silence. Each case slightly different.
But the feeling, the tone, the method.
Uncomfortably close. Still, there's no proof. No shared evidence. No direct link. Just instinct. And instinct isn't enough. The theory stalls. Again. Because without something tangible, something undeniable, it remains speculation. And speculation doesn't solve cases. Time moves on. Late 1990s. Then 2000. 15 years. 15 years without an answer. Laura Bennett becomes a name people recognize but don't fully remember. A story told occasionally. A warning. A reminder that even quiet places can hide something dark. Her family continues. Older now.
Tired.
But still searching. Still asking. Still holding on to the possibility that one day someone will say something that changes everything. Inside the system, the case waits. Not forgotten. But not active. A file among many. A question without an answer. But something has changed.
Subtle.
Almost invisible. The world is catching up. Technology advancing faster than anyone predicted. Databases expanding. Information connecting. And evidence, old evidence, beginning to find its voice. That strand of hair, once meaningless, now potentially everything. But it will take time. More time. Years more. Because progress doesn't arrive all at once. It builds. Slowly. Quietly. Until one day it breaks through. And when it does, cases like this don't just reopen. They explode. But in this moment, none of that has happened yet. All that exists is the waiting, the silence, the unanswered questions that refuse to disappear. A woman who vanished. A man who was never identified. A car left running in the middle of nowhere. And the growing, unsettling realization that the truth was never gone. It was just out of reach.
For now.
Time doesn't just pass. It reshapes everything around a case like this. By the early 2000s, the world is unrecognizable compared to 1985. Technology moves faster. Databases expand. Information that once sat isolated begins to connect across states, across years, across cases that never knew they were related. And buried inside a storage room in northern Arizona, a sealed evidence box waits for that moment to arrive. The Bennett case hasn't been touched in years. Not seriously. Occasional reviews, routine audits, but nothing that suggests movement, nothing that suggests progress. Until one quiet afternoon, a cold case unit is formed. Not because of Laura alone. Because of dozens like her. Files stacked high, names fading, families waiting. The purpose is simple. Reopen what was once impossible. Apply what didn't exist before. And listen again. The Bennett file lands on the desk of a new investigator. Younger than the original team. Trained in a different era. Less willing to accept silence as an answer. He doesn't start with theories. He starts with the evidence. Every photograph. Every report. Every detail documented decades earlier by people who knew it might matter one day. The car. The diner. The witness. The unknown man. And then the evidence log. He stops there. Reads it slowly. Fingerprints, partial. Fibers, nonspecific. Hair, unknown origin. That word again. Unknown. He stares at it longer than the others. Because in 2002, unknown doesn't mean what it used to. The evidence box is retrieved. Signed out. Transported carefully. Chain of custody intact, preserved through years of inactivity. Inside a lab that didn't exist in 1985, technicians prepare to examine what was once considered unsolvable. The hair is removed. Placed under controlled light. Magnified. Documented again. But this time it's different. Because now they're not just looking at it. They're asking it to speak. DNA extraction begins.
Slow.
Delicate. Because the sample is small. Fragile. Decades old. There's no guarantee it will yield anything. No certainty it hasn't degraded. No promise this will work. Days pass. Then weeks. The process continues quietly, far from the public eye, far from the family, far from the place where the case began. And then a result. Partial. But usable. A DNA profile. Not complete. But enough. Enough to enter into a system that didn't exist when Laura disappeared. CODIS. The Combined DNA Index System. A network of profiles. Offenders. Arrestees. Unknown samples. All waiting for matches. The profile is uploaded.
Logged. Compared.
Minutes pass. Then hours. Then days. Nothing. No match. No immediate answer. But unlike 1985, that doesn't mean failure. Because now, the evidence doesn't go silent again. It stays in the system. Waiting. Comparing. Checking every new entry that comes in. Day after day. Year after year. Meanwhile, the investigator keeps working. Because DNA is just one piece. And this case has always been about more than one piece. He revisits the diner. Not physically, it's changed now, renovated, different owners, but through records, interviews, archived statements. The waitress is older now. Memory softened by time. But still there. Still certain about one thing. The man. His presence. His control. She repeats the word again. Controlled. It echoes through the years like something that refuses to fade. The investigator studies behavioral patterns. Not just evidence. Behavior. Because behavior leaves traces too. The way someone approaches.
The way they speak.
The way they leave. It forms a profile. Not a face. Not a name. But a shape. Someone organized. Calm under pressure. Capable of blending in. Someone who doesn't rush. Someone who doesn't panic. And most importantly, someone who has done something like this before. Or would again. That possibility changes everything. Because if Laura Bennett wasn't the only one, then somewhere out there, there are more traces. More evidence. More chances for a mistake. The investigator expands the scope. Pulls cases from other states again. But now, the world is different. Records are digitized. Databases searchable. Patterns easier to detect. He builds a timeline. Overlays cases. Marks similarities. Late-night encounters. Highways. Unidentified men. Vehicles left behind. It's not perfect. But it's closer than it's ever been. Still nothing concrete. No shared DNA. No confirmed suspect. Just a tightening net around something that still refuses to show itself. Years pass. 2003. 2004. 2005. The DNA profile sits quietly in Cody's. No match. No hit. But it remains active. Waiting. Because every new arrest, every new profile entered into the system, is another chance. And then in 2006, something almost happens. A partial overlap. Not a full match. Not enough to identify, but enough to flag. Another unknown sample. Different case. Different state. Similar profile. The system marks it. Links them. Barely. Tentatively. But it's the first time in over 20 years that the Bennett case connects to anything real. The investigator leans in. Studies both cases side by side. Another woman. Another late-night encounter. Another disappearance. But this time there was a body. Recovered months later. Too degraded for clear answers at the time. But evidence preserved. Including hair. The comparison isn't perfect. But it's close enough to matter. Close enough to suggest a possibility that had only existed as theory before. This wasn't isolated. This wasn't random. This might be a pattern. A person moving across states. Across years. Leaving behind fragments. Never enough to be caught.
Until now.
But might isn't enough. Not yet. The case gains quiet momentum again. Not public. Not announced. But inside the system, something has shifted. The Bennett file is no longer sleeping. It's moving. Slowly.
Carefully.
But moving. Because for the first time in decades, there is a direction. There is a connection. There is the faint outline of something real. And somewhere out there, a man who once walked into a diner, placed his hand on a woman's arm, and disappeared into the night, may not be as invisible as he thought. Not anymore. Because evidence doesn't forget.
And now, finally,
It's starting to remember. Connections don't arrive loudly. They slip in quietly, almost unnoticed at first, like a loose thread that doesn't look important until someone starts pulling. By 2007, the Bennett case is no longer just a single file on a shelf. It has edges now, thin, fragile, but real, reaching outward towards something larger, something that has been moving in the background for years without a name. The partial DNA link from the other state doesn't confirm anything. Not yet. But it changes the way the investigation breathes. Because now there is a second scene. A second timeline. A second victim who didn't vanish without a trace. And that difference matters. The investigator studies that case in detail. Not quickly. Not casually.
he slows down.
Because speed never solved this. He looks at the location first. A roadside area outside a small town, miles from any major city.
Quiet.
Isolated. The kind of place where people pass through without stopping, and those who do aren't always remembered. The victim, another young woman, similar age to Laura, was last seen speaking with an unidentified man. Witnesses described him the same way.
Tall. Calm.
Unremarkable in a way that makes him impossible to remember clearly. The body had been found months later. Far from the road. Partially concealed. Time had taken most of the answers with it. But not all. Because evidence had been collected. Preserved. And, among it, strands of hair. When the comparison was made years later, the result didn't shout. It whispered. A partial match. Not enough to declare identity, but enough to suggest the same source. The same presence. The same unknown person standing at the edge of two different lives in two different states years apart. That's when the question changes. It's no longer who took Laura Bennett. Now it becomes, how many times did he do this? The investigation expands again. But this time, it isn't scattered. It's focused. Cases aren't pulled randomly. They're selected based on behavior, approach, environment, victim profile. And slowly, a pattern begins to form. Not clean, not perfect, but consistent enough to feel real. Late-night encounters. Isolated roads. Women traveling alone. A man who doesn't force his way in but finds a way to be invited, or at least not resisted. That detail becomes critical. Because it explains something that never made sense. The lack of struggle. The absence of noise. The quiet compliance. This wasn't someone who attacked in chaos. This was someone who controlled the situation before it ever turned violent. Someone who knew how to lower defenses. Someone who knew how to appear safe. The investigator builds a behavioral profile. Not from textbooks. From fragments. From the way the man was described. From the way the scenes were left behind. He writes it down carefully.
Male.
Likely between late 20s and early 40s during the original incident. Comfortable speaking to strangers. Able to project calm authority or familiarity. Possibly transient, or at least mobile across state lines. Organized. Patient. Not impulsive. And most importantly, confident in his ability to disappear. That last detail is the most dangerous. Because confidence like that usually comes from experience, from repetition, from knowing what works and knowing what doesn't. Which means somewhere along the way he may have made a mistake.
Small.
Almost invisible. But enough. That's what they're looking for now. Not a confession. Not a witness who suddenly remembers everything.
A mistake.
Because even the most controlled individuals aren't perfect. Time wears down precision. Memory fades. Habits slip. The system, however, doesn't forget. The DNA profile remains active. Every new entry into Cody's becomes another silent comparison. Another chance. Meanwhile, the investigator digs deeper into geographic patterns. He maps the known and suspected cases, pins them across the Southwest. Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada. Lines begin to connect, not straight, not obvious, but suggestive.
Routes.
Highways. Travel paths. The kind someone might follow if they were moving for work, or avoiding staying in one place too long. He cross-references employment types. Jobs that require travel. Jobs that place someone near roads, near small towns, near places where people stop briefly and move on. Truck drivers. Construction crews. Utility workers. Sales representatives. Names begin to surface again. Old lists revisited with new criteria. People who were overlooked before. Not because they didn't matter. Because they didn't stand out. And that's exactly what makes them dangerous. One name catches attention. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Just repeatedly. Appearing in different places. Different times. Different contexts. A man who had worked temporary jobs across multiple states during the late 80s and early 90s. Construction. Road maintenance. Short-term contracts. Always moving. Always leaving. Never staying long enough to be known. His name had come up once before. Briefly. Years ago.
Dismissed.
No direct link. No evidence. Just proximity. Now, with the emerging pattern, proximity means more. The investigator pulls everything on him. Employment records. Addresses. Known associates. Nothing criminal. Nothing obvious. But the timeline aligns. Uncomfortably well. He was in Arizona in 1985. Working on a highway project less than 50 miles from where Laura's car was found. Months later gone. Next record places him in New Mexico. Then Nevada. Then back again. A loop. Not precise. But consistent. Still, it's not enough. It's never enough. Because suspicion without evidence is just another dead end. And this case has had too many of those already. The DNA becomes the focus again. Because if this man is connected, there has to be a way to prove it. But there's a problem. He's never been arrested. Never processed. No DNA on file. Which means no match in Cody's. Which means the system can't see him. Not yet. The frustration builds. Because they are closer than they've ever been. Closer than anyone was in 1985. Closer than anyone imagined in the 90s. And still just out of reach. But something has changed. The investigation is no longer drifting. It has direction. It has a shape. It has a shadow that is beginning to look like a person. And somewhere, that person is living a life. Normal. Unremarkable. Possibly believing that time has erased everything. That the desert kept it secret. that the silence held. But silence doesn't last forever. Not when evidence is waiting. Not when connections begin to form. Not when one small mistake is all it takes. The Bennett case, once buried under years of dust and doubt, is no longer quiet. It's tightening. Slowly. Deliberately. Like a circle closing in. And, at the center of it, a man who doesn't know yet that after decades of disappearing, something is finally starting to find him. By 2008, the case is no longer fragile. It has weight again. Not the kind that comes from answers, but the kind that builds when questions begin to point in the same direction. For the first time in decades, the Bennett investigation has something it never truly had before. Focus. Not scattered theories. Not disconnected leads. A single, narrowing path. And at the end of that path, a name that refuses to disappear. The man who had once been nothing more than background noise in old reports is now being examined under a different light. Every movement. Every job. Every place he had been. It's all laid out, mapped with precision the original investigators could never have achieved. Because now, time is no longer the enemy. It's the evidence. His name surfaces in records tied to temporary roadwork contracts across the Southwest. Arizona in late 1985. New Mexico in early 1986. Nevada shortly after. Always near highways. Always near the kind of locations where people pass through alone, unnoticed. The pattern isn't perfect. But it doesn't need to be. It just needs to be consistent enough to matter. And it is. The investigator studies him carefully. Not just the records. The behavior. Because behavior doesn't lie the way people can. The diner. That moment has never faded. A man who walks in without hesitation. Approaches directly. Speaks quietly. Leaves with control. That's not chance. That's intention. And intention leaves patterns. They begin looking for witnesses again. Not the ones from 1985. New ones. People who may have crossed paths with him in the years after. Co-workers. Supervisors. Neighbors from places he briefly lived. The responses are predictable. He kept to himself. Quiet guy. Nothing unusual. But then something small. A former coworker remembers him differently. Not loud. Not aggressive. But observant. Always watching. Always aware of who was around him. Who was coming. Who was leaving. The kind of awareness that doesn't come naturally. It's learned. Or practiced. That detail is written down. Underlined. Because it fits. Too well. Another remembers his habits. He preferred night shifts when possible. Less supervision. Fewer people. More space. More control. Again, it fits. But still, there's nothing that ties him directly to Laura Bennett. Nothing that places him in that diner. Nothing that proves he was the man the waitress saw. Just alignment. Just possibility. And possibility isn't enough to close a case. So they turn back to the one thing that doesn't rely on memory. DNA. The partial profile from the hair remains their strongest lead. But without a match, it's a locked door. Unless they find a way to open it from the other side. That's when a different strategy begins to take shape. If they can't match him directly through Cody's, they find him indirectly. Family. Relatives. Biological connections. Because DNA doesn't exist in isolation. It connects. Across generations. Across branches of families that may not even know each other. In 2008, this approach is still emerging. Not widely used. Not fully understood. But possible. The investigator begins building a family tree, starting with the suspect, tracing outward. Parents, siblings, extended relatives, anyone who might have had contact with law enforcement, anyone who might already have DNA in the system. It's slow, complex. Records are incomplete. Some names lead nowhere. Others branch into dozens more. But gradually a network forms. And within that network, a possibility. A distant relative. Arrested years earlier. DNA entered into the system. The comparison is requested. Carefully. Quietly. Because this is the kind of step that can't be undone. Days pass. Then weeks. And then a result. Not a match. But a connection. Partial. Familial. Enough to suggest that the unknown DNA from the Bennett case belongs to someone related to this individual. The room shifts when the result comes in. Not celebration. Not yet. But something close to it. Because for the first time, the evidence is no longer silent. It's pointing. Not directly. But clearly enough to follow. The investigator returns to the suspect. Everything is re-examined. This time with a different lens. Not could it be him? But how do we prove it is? Surveillance becomes the next step. Quiet. Unobtrusive. Because after decades, the man has a life. Routine. Patterns. And somewhere within that routine, an opportunity. They watch. Not constantly. But enough. Enough to understand his habits. When he leaves. Where he goes. What he touches. Because DNA doesn't just exist in labs. It exists everywhere. On objects. On surfaces. On things people discard without thinking. A coffee cup. A cigarette. A napkin. Something small. Something ordinary. Something that carries the truth. Days turn into weeks. The waiting returns. But this time it feels different. Because now, they're not waiting for the past to speak. They're creating the moment where it will. And then it happens. Not dramatic. Not planned. Just timing. He finishes a drink. Leaves the container behind. Walks away without looking back. They move quickly. Carefully. Retrieve it. Bag it. Label it. Chain of custody begins. Inside the lab, the process starts again. Extraction. Analysis. Comparison. The same steps that began with a single strand of hair decades ago. But this time the source is known. The question is simple. Do they match? The room is quiet when the results come in. Because everyone understands what it means. Not just for the case, but for the years. The waiting. The silence. And when the answer appears, it doesn't whisper. It doesn't hesitate. It's clear. Definitive. Unavoidable. A match. The DNA from the discarded item matches the DNA from the hair found in Laura Bennett's car. Decades collapse into a single moment. Every unanswered question. Every theory. Every doubt. They all narrow down to one point. One person. One truth. The man who had moved quietly through states, through years, through lives without leaving a name, is no longer unknown. And for the first time since 1985, the case is no longer asking who. Now it knows. And that changes everything. A name changes everything. Not because it ends the mystery, but because it transforms it. For more than 2 decades, the Bennett case was defined by absence.
No suspect.
No identity, just a shadow moving through fragments of memory and evidence that refused to speak. Now that shadow has a shape, a history, a life that can be examined, dissected, understood. But with that clarity comes something else. A deeper question. Not just who he is, but what he's done. The moment the DNA match is confirmed, the investigation shifts into something faster, sharper, more dangerous. Because the man they've been watching, the man who has lived quietly, almost invisibly for years, is no longer a possibility. He's the center. Everything begins to move around him. His name is entered into systems. His past pulled apart piece by piece. Records that once seemed ordinary are now viewed through a different lens. Every address,
Every job.
every gap in time,
It all matters now.
and the pattern that once looked like coincidence begins to tighten into something undeniable. He wasn't just traveling. He was moving. Deliberately.
Consistently.
Across the same corridors where other disappearances had been reported. Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada. Back again. Always near highways. Always near places where people could vanish without witnesses. The behavioral profile aligns almost perfectly. Controlled.
Calm.
Methodical. But there's something else. Something more unsettling. There's no record of escalation.
No arrests. No complaints.
No history of violence. Which means one of two things. Either he was incredibly careful, or he was never suspected. The second possibility is worse. Because it means he didn't just avoid being caught. He avoided being seen. Investigators begin reconstructing his timeline in detail. Not just where he worked, where he lived.
Who he interacted with.
Neighbors are interviewed. Old coworkers tracked down. People who knew him casually. Briefly. Long enough to form impressions. The descriptions are consistent. Quiet. Polite. Forgettable. The kind of person you don't notice twice. The kind of person who doesn't leave an impression. And that becomes the most disturbing detail of all. Because invisibility isn't accidental. It's a skill. And he had mastered it. Meanwhile, the case begins to reopen publicly. Carefully at first. Then with growing attention. The headline spreads. Arizona 1985 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough identifies suspect after decades. The community reacts the way it did in the beginning.
Shock.
Disbelief. But this time it's different. Because now there is someone to look at. Someone to blame. Someone who lived among them or near them or passed through without ever being questioned. Laura Bennett's family is notified. Privately. Before the news reaches everyone else. The moment is not relief. Not immediately. It's something more complicated. Because knowing who doesn't answer everything. It doesn't explain what happened in those missing hours. It doesn't bring her back. But it ends one kind of silence. The worst kind. The kind where there is no direction, no name, no possibility of justice. Now there is. And that changes how the investigation moves forward. Because identification is only the beginning. Now comes the harder part. Proving everything else. Building a case strong enough to stand in court. Strong enough to survive scrutiny. strong enough to answer questions that have waited decades. Investigators return to the diner connection. The waitress is shown a new image. Older now. Different. But something remains. The posture.
The eyes.
The stillness. She studies it for a long time. Longer than anyone expects. And then a shift. Not certainty, but recognition. A quiet, unsettling familiarity. She doesn't say that's him. She says something else. He feels the same. It's not enough for court, but it matters. Because memory doesn't always return as clarity. Sometimes it returns as instinct. And instinct has been right before. The second case, the one that provided the partial DNA link, is reopened with urgency. Evidence re-examined. Timelines compared. Now that there is a suspect, the pieces begin to align more clearly. Locations match his movements. Time frames overlap. Opportunities exist. Still, the burden of proof remains heavy. Because one match, one connection doesn't define everything.
It suggests.
It points. But it must be built upon. The investigation expands again. Other unsolved cases reviewed with his name in mind. Not just similarities now. Direct comparisons. Evidence pulled. Tested. Reanalyzed with modern methods. Some yield nothing. Others begin to whisper. Partial links. Inconclusive overlaps. Enough to raise questions. Not enough to confirm. And that uncertainty becomes its own pressure. Because if he is responsible for more, then there are more stories, more families, more years of waiting. The weight of that possibility grows with each passing day. Meanwhile, surveillance shifts into preparation. Because now they know. And when you know, you act. But carefully. Because a man who has avoided detection for decades is not careless. He is not reckless. He is patient. And patience can turn into danger when threatened. The decision isn't rushed.
It can't be.
Every step must be precise. Every piece of evidence secured. Because once they move, there is no going back. The moment arrives quietly.
No sirens. No dramatica enfrentación.
Just a controlled approach. The same word that has followed this case from the beginning. Controlled. He is taken into custody without resistance.
No struggle. No surprise.
Almost as if he expected it eventually. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere shifts again. Because this is where everything changes. For decades, he existed as a question. Now he sits as an answer. But answers don't always speak. He is calm.
Composed.
The same presence described years earlier. The same stillness. The same control. Detectives present the evidence. Slowly. Deliberately. The DNA. The timeline. The connections. Each piece placed carefully, like building a structure that cannot be ignored. He listens. Watches. Says very little. Because silence has always been his strongest defense. And breaking that silence will be the hardest part of all. Because the truth is no longer hidden. But it's not fully revealed either. Not yet. And somewhere between what is known and what remains unsaid, the final pieces of this case are still waiting to fall into place. The interrogation room is silent. Not the empty silence of the desert. A different kind. A heavier one. The kind that exists when two sides sit across from each other knowing that everything has changed. For more than 20 years, the Bennett case lived inside unanswered questions. Investigators searched for a face,
A name.
a connection. Now the person they were searching for is sitting directly in front of them. The man who was once only a description. The man who existed only in a witness statement. The man who had been reduced to a sketch, a theory, a possibility. Now has a name. A voice. A heartbeat. But the hardest part of any cold case is not finding the suspect. It is proving what happened and making him face it. The detectives begin slowly. No accusations at first.
No anger.
Just facts. October 1985. Arizona Highway. A missing woman. A vehicle left running. Evidence recovered from inside. A strand of hair. A DNA profile. The suspect listens without interruption. His expression barely changes. The same calmness that appeared in every description from decades earlier. The investigators notice it immediately. The control. The restraint. The ability to remain still while everything around him collapses. It reminds them of the diner witness. A man who didn't rush. A man who didn't panic. A man who seemed completely comfortable in moments where most people would feel pressure. But now that calmness is being tested. Because the evidence is different. The world is different. And the mistakes from 1985 have finally caught up. The detectives place photographs on the table. Laura's car. The empty road. The evidence markers. Images taken before anyone knew how important they would become. They ask simple questions. Do you remember this area? Do you remember working in Arizona? Do you remember meeting Laura Bennett? The answers come carefully.
Short.
Controlled. He denies knowing her. Denies being near the vehicle. Denies involvement. At first, it appears familiar. A suspect refusing to admit anything. But investigators expected this. They were not relying on words. They were relying on science. The DNA evidence is explained. The timeline. The connection. The impossible coincidence of a person's biological material appearing inside a missing woman's abandoned vehicle. There are no easy explanations. No innocent reason. The room becomes quieter. Because everyone understands what the evidence means. The past has finally arrived. But the suspect still refuses to give them what they want. A confession. And without one, the investigation continues. Because a cold case solved is not the same as a cold case finished. The prosecutors need every detail. Every connection. Every piece of the story. They begin rebuilding Laura's final night again. But this time, they are not searching blindly. They know where the story ends. Now they have to prove how it began. They return to the diner. The witness statement. The unidentified man. The moment that was forgotten by almost everyone except one person. The waitress. Years have passed. Her life has changed. But the memory remains. She reviews the old sketch. The old notes. Then the new information. The name. The photograph. The confirmation. And suddenly, the stranger from decades ago is no longer a stranger. She remembers details she had almost buried. The way he stood. The way he approached. The way Laura looked at him. Not like a stranger. Not completely. That detail creates another question. Did Laura know him? Was this a random encounter? Or had he found a way into her life before that night? Investigators dig deeper into Laura's routines. Her workplace. Her daily habits. Her social circles. They find no direct connection. No hidden relationship. No evidence that she knew him personally. But they discover something important. He did not need to know her. He only needed to understand her. Her routine. Her movements. Her vulnerability. That realization changes the emotional weight of the case, because it suggests something much colder. Planning. Not a sudden act. Not an uncontrollable moment. A decision. A choice. A person watching and waiting. The prosecution begins building the timeline of the suspect's movements. Employment records. Travel history. Addresses. Financial records. The picture becomes clearer. He was in the region. He had opportunity. He had access.
And now,
He had been connected through DNA. The defense prepares its response. The argument is expected.
time,
Memory. Uncertainty. They question whether decades-old evidence can truly tell the full story. They challenge the reliability of witnesses. They point to gaps. Because gaps exist. They always do in cases this old. But the investigators understand something important. They don't need every missing piece. They need enough. Enough to show the truth beyond doubt. And for the first time in decades, they have enough. The arrest becomes national news. A case that had faded into history suddenly returns. Families of other victims watch closely. Because every cold case breakthrough creates another question. If this happened once, what else is hidden? Investigators begin receiving messages.
tips,
Stories.
names,
People who remember something strange from years ago. A neighbor. A coworker. A vehicle. A conversation that felt wrong. Most leads go nowhere. But some are reviewed carefully. Because the possibility remains. Laura may not have been the only victim. And that possibility becomes the darkest part of the investigation. The suspect sits behind the attention now. A person who lived for decades believing the past was buried. He built a life after 1985.
worked, moved, aged,
Walked through ordinary places surrounded by ordinary people. While one family waited for answers. While one community remembered. While one evidence box sat quietly holding the truth. That contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The world moved forward. But the crime never did. It stayed frozen. Waiting for technology. Waiting for time. Waiting for one mistake. And that mistake was DNA. But even with the breakthrough, there is still one unanswered question. Where is Laura? The evidence explains who. It does not explain everything. It does not reveal the final moments. It does not tell her family what happened after the car was abandoned. And that missing piece remains the most painful one. Because justice is not only about finding the person responsible. It is about understanding what was taken. What was lost. What happened in those final hours when Laura disappeared into the darkness of an Arizona night. The investigation continues. Searches are conducted. Old locations revisited. New technology applied. Every possible lead examined. Because after decades of waiting, the truth is finally close. Closer than ever. But close is not the same as complete. And somewhere beneath the surface of this solved cold case, there are still secrets waiting to be uncovered. For decades, the question was always the same. Where did Laura Bennett go? Now, after years of silence, investigators finally know who they believe was responsible. But one mystery remains. The most painful one. The one that has haunted Laura's family since the night she vanished. What happened after the car was found? What happened between the moment she disappeared and the moment the evidence was left behind? A name had been uncovered. A suspect identified. But the story was still incomplete. And incomplete answers are sometimes the hardest ones to accept. The investigation enters a new phase. Not a search for a person. A search for the truth. The suspect's arrest creates movement unlike anything the case has seen before. Old evidence is reopened. Old locations are revisited. Every possibility that was once dismissed is examined again. Because time changes what investigators can find. Technology has advanced. Methods have improved. Places that once seemed empty can now reveal information. The desert that swallowed the answers in 1985 is no longer the same place. Investigators return to the area where Laura's car was discovered. The highway has changed. The landscape has changed. But the question remains exactly the same. Was this where everything ended? Or was it simply where someone wanted them to look? They walk the terrain again. Not searching randomly. Searching with purpose. The original investigators had searched for a missing woman. This time, they're searching for evidence connected to a known suspect. The difference is enormous. Every movement has meaning. Every location has context. The team examines possible routes. Places where someone could have traveled unnoticed. Areas where evidence might have remained hidden. But the desert offers no easy answers. Years of weather. Construction. Natural changes. Human activity. Everything has altered the landscape. Still, they continue. Because after waiting this long, they refuse to stop at the first breakthrough. Meanwhile, investigators examine the suspect's life after 1985. And what they discover creates a disturbing picture. A person capable of blending in. A person who could move through communities without attracting attention. He changed jobs. Changed locations. Built relationships. Created a normal appearance. To everyone around him, he was ordinary. That detail becomes one of the most unsettling parts of a case. Because the most dangerous secrets are not always hidden behind obvious signs. Sometimes they exist behind familiar faces. Behind routine conversations. Behind people nobody ever thinks to question. Neighbors describe him as quiet. Not unfriendly. Not suspicious. Just private. The kind of person who keeps his distance. The kind of person who leaves little behind. And that personality trait becomes significant. Because someone who wants to disappear does not always hide. Sometimes they simply become invisible. Investigators also revisit the possibility of other victims. The DNA connection had already suggested a larger pattern. Now they look deeper. Cold cases across multiple states are reviewed again. Not just cases involving missing women. Cases involving unusual circumstances.
Vehicles abandonat.
Late-night disappearances. Unexplained encounters. Stories that once seemed unrelated. Some possibilities disappear quickly. Others remain. But one thing becomes clear. The suspect had access to many places. He traveled. He moved through areas where people rarely question strangers. The highways that connected the Southwest also created opportunities. Long roads. Small towns. Temporary workers. People passing through. Places where someone could arrive without being noticed. And leave before anyone realized they had been there. The investigators examine his movements around the time of Laura's disappearance. The timeline becomes one of the strongest pieces of the case. He was there. He had the opportunity. The evidence connected him. And the behavior matched. But prosecutors know something important. A strong case is built with patience. Not emotion. Not assumptions.
Facts.
Every detail must survive examination. Every statement must be supported. Every conclusion must be backed by evidence. Because after 30 years, everyone wants the same thing. Not just an arrest. Justice. The family watches as the case moves forward. For them, the arrest creates conflicting emotions. There is relief. Finally, someone is responsible. Finally, someone is answering for what happened. But there is also grief. Because no courtroom can restore the years lost. No verdict can erase the empty chair. No sentence can return the person they lost. The passage of time creates a strange reality. The world has changed. Children grew up. Technology transformed. Generations moved forward. But for Laura's family, one night in 1985 remained permanently frozen. The night the phone never rang. The night the car was found. The night a normal life was interrupted forever. Now, decades later, they are finally hearing answers. But answers can hurt too. Because sometimes the truth is not the ending people hoped for. It is simply the ending they needed. As the trial preparations begin, investigators continue gathering evidence. The original reports are reviewed. The photographs. The statements. The records. Everything is brought together. The case that once existed as fragments becomes a complete story. A timeline emerges. A woman leaves dinner. A suspicious encounter occurs. A vehicle is discovered abandoned. Evidence remains hidden for years. Science catches up. And a suspect is finally identified. The story that began with a question mark now has a direction. But one final piece remains. The location of Laura. The discovery that could provide her family with the closure they have waited decades to receive. Search teams return. Experts analyze. New methods are applied. The hope is simple. Find the missing piece. Find where the desert has kept her. But the search is difficult. Because nature does not preserve everything. And time does not always return what it takes. Still, they continue. Because every missing person deserves more than a file number. More than a photograph on a wall. More than a name in an old report. Laura Bennett was not just a cold case. She was a daughter. A friend. A teacher. A person whose life mattered. And after all these years, the world is finally saying her name again. Not because she disappeared, but because she was found in the only way a cold case can truly be found. Through the truth. Through persistence. Through evidence that refused to stay silent. The desert kept its secrets for decades. But secrets do not last forever. Not when people keep searching. Not when families keep waiting. Not when evidence finally gets a voice. And now, after 30 years of uncertainty, the silence surrounding Laura Bennett is beginning to break. For 30 years, Laura Bennett existed in a space between memory and mystery. A photograph.
A name.
A story people repeated but never completed. A woman who left a dinner in October 1985 and disappeared into the darkness of an Arizona night. For decades, the world had only questions. Now, for the first time, it had answers. But answers do not always arrive like people imagine. They do not erase pain. They do not rewind time. They do not bring back the moments that were stolen. Sometimes answers simply open the door to the truth that was waiting behind it all along. And for Laura's family, that truth begins with a search. A final search. The suspect had been identified. The evidence had connected him. But one piece of the story remained unfinished. Where was Laura? The investigation team understood the importance of that question. A conviction could bring justice. A confession could bring understanding. But finding Laura could bring something else.
Peace.
A place to visit. A place to remember. A place where decades of uncertainty could finally end. The search begins with everything they know. The original crime scene. The timeline. The suspect's movements. Every location connected to his life after 1985. Investigators create maps. Not just of where he had been, but where he could have gone.
Routes.
Distances. Possible stops. Places where a person could disappear without attracting attention. The same highways that allowed him to move freely decades earlier now become the focus. Every road tells a story. Every abandoned area becomes a possibility. The search teams return to locations that had once seemed meaningless. A forgotten piece of land. A remote area outside town. A place where nobody would think to look. Because that was the nature of the crime. The person responsible had relied on isolation.
Distance.
Silence. But now those same things are being used against him. Technology changes the search. Satellite images.
Advanced mapping.
Ground-penetrating tools. Methods that did not exist in 1985. The landscape begins revealing details hidden from the original investigators. But even modern technology has limits. The desert is enormous. The years are unforgiving. And every possible location carries the same painful uncertainty. Could she be here? Could this be where the final answer has been waiting? The investigators move carefully. Because this is no longer just a case. It is someone's life. Someone's family. Someone who has been waiting decades for this moment. Meanwhile, the prosecution prepares for trial. The evidence is strong. The DNA connection. The timeline. The witness identification. The behavioral pattern. But the defense challenges everything. They question memory. They question interpretation. They question whether decades-old evidence can truly tell the complete story. It becomes a battle between the past and the present. Between what was known in 1985 and what science discovered years later. The prosecutors understand the challenge. They cannot ask the jury to simply believe. They must show. They must build the story piece by piece. The same way investigators rebuilt the case. Slowly.
Carefully.
One detail at a time. They begin with Laura. Not the suspect. Not the evidence. Laura. They tell the jury who she was before she became a cold case. A teacher.
A daughter.
A person with plans. A person with a future. Because behind every piece of evidence is a human being. And behind every unanswered question is a family that lived with it. The courtroom hears about the night she disappeared. The dinner.
The drive.
The vehicle. The empty highway. The evidence that waited decades to reveal what happened. The DNA becomes the center of the case. A microscopic piece of history. Something invisible that survived when memories faded. When witnesses aged. When newspapers stopped writing. When the world moved on. The same evidence that could not speak in 1985 finally tells its story. And the message is clear. The suspect had been connected to Laura's disappearance all along. He simply existed in an era when the tools were not ready to find him. That becomes one of the most powerful parts of the case. The crime was not unsolved because the truth was gone. The truth was there. Waiting. The suspect's defense struggles against that reality. Because science has changed the meaning of evidence. What once seemed useless is now undeniable. The strand of hair that sat untouched for decades became the key that unlocked everything. A reminder that every detail matters. Every piece collected. Every decision made by investigators who had no way of knowing whether their work would ever lead anywhere. The original detectives had failed to solve the case, but they had not failed to preserve it. And that made the difference. As the trial continues, attention returns to the suspect's behavior. The calm, the silence, the lack of explanation. The same qualities that once helped him avoid suspicion now become part of the story against him. Because control can protect someone for a long time. But eventually, control creates patterns. And patterns can be recognized. The courtroom hears about the other investigations connected to him. Not every suspicion becomes a charge. Not every question becomes an answer. But the possibility remains. That Laura's case may have been part of something larger. A life moving through places. A person leaving behind fragments. The investigators continue looking. Because solving one case often reveals another. And every family deserves the same answers Laura's family fought for. Outside the courtroom, the community watches. People who remember the original headlines. People who were children when Laura disappeared. People who grew up hearing about the mystery. Now they see the ending arriving. Not quickly. Not easily. But finally. The words "cold case solved" appear across newspapers again. But behind those words is a much bigger story. A story about patience. About technology. About investigators who refuse to let a file disappear. About evidence that survived decades of silence. And about a woman whose name refused to be forgotten. The search for Laura continues even as the legal process moves forward. Because justice is not only measured by a verdict, it is also measured by compassion, by respect, by bringing someone home. The desert remains quiet. The highway remains busy. People still drive the same roads where the mystery began. But something has changed. The place no longer represents only disappearance. It represents persistence. A reminder that even the oldest questions can still have answers. Even the coldest cases can still burn. Even after 30 years, the truth can still find its way back. For decades, the Bennett case was a wound that never closed. It remained open in the minds of investigators. Open in the hearts of Laura's family. Open in a community that never fully stopped wondering what happened on that dark Arizona highway in 1985. But now, after years of waiting, the final chapter begins. Not with a dramatic discovery. Not with a sudden confession. But with something far more powerful. The truth. A truth that survived 30 years of silence. The final stage of the investigation is no longer about finding a suspect. That battle has already been won. Now it is about understanding the full story of Laura Bennett.
Who she was.
What happened to her. And how a case that seemed impossible was finally solved. The courtroom becomes the place where decades of unanswered questions are brought into the light. The prosecution presents a timeline built from thousands of hours of investigation. A timeline that begins with an ordinary evening. A birthday dinner. A simple goodbye. A drive home that should have ended like any other night. But somewhere between that restaurant and the empty highway, everything changed. The evidence shows how one small detail became the beginning of the end for the person responsible. A strand of hair. A piece of evidence so small that in 1985, it seemed almost meaningless. It sat in storage, ignored by time, waiting for science to catch up. And when science finally did, it spoke. The DNA evidence becomes the centerpiece of the trial. Not because it is dramatic, not because it creates a shocking moment, but because it is undeniable. It connects the suspect to the vehicle. It connects the present to the past. It bridges a gap of 3 decades. 30 years between the crime and the answer. The defense attempts to create doubt. They question the passage of time. They question the reliability of memories. They question whether old evidence can truly carry the weight of a modern conviction. But the prosecution returns to one simple point. The evidence was always there. The world simply did not have the ability to understand it yet. The investigators did not create the truth. They uncovered it. The jury hears from witnesses who carried memories for years. The waitress who remembered the strange encounter. The investigators who refused to abandon the file. The experts who transformed a forgotten piece of evidence into a breakthrough. Each person represents a different moment in the timeline. Each person contributed a piece. And together, those pieces form the picture that had been missing for so long. The most emotional moments come when Laura's family speaks. Not about the suspect. Not about punishment. About Laura. They describe the person behind the headlines. The young woman who loved teaching. The daughter who was deeply missed. The person whose absence changed everything. Because cold cases often become numbers.
Dates.
Locations. Evidence tags. But Laura was never just a case file. She was a person. And that is what makes the resolution matter. After decades of uncertainty, her family finally hears what they have been waiting for. They know what happened. They know who was responsible. They know the mystery that haunted them has an answer. But closure is complicated. There is relief. But there is also grief. Because solving a case does not erase the years spent searching. It does not return birthdays. It does not restore moments lost forever. Justice can arrive late. But it cannot reverse time. The verdict comes after weeks of testimony. The evidence. The timeline. The connections. Everything presented. Everything examined. And then the decision.
Guilty.
A single word. But behind it are decades of work. Decades of waiting. Decades of people refusing to let Laura disappear completely. The courtroom remains quiet as the verdict is read.
No celebration.
No feeling of victory. Only the heavy realization that a chapter has finally ended. Outside, the news spreads quickly. The headline that once seemed impossible becomes reality. Arizona 1985 cold case solved. A case that survived generations. A mystery that outlasted technology, investigators, and time itself.
Solved.
But the story does not end there. Because every solved cold case leaves behind another question. How many others remain? How many families are still waiting? How many pieces of evidence are sitting quietly somewhere, holding answers no one has discovered yet? The Bennett case becomes a reminder. A reminder that time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes time preserves it. The fingerprints that meant nothing decades ago. The DNA that could not be tested. The reports stored away. The memories carried by witnesses. Everything mattered. Everything waited. And when the moment came, everything connected. The investigation also changes the way future cold cases are viewed. Because it proves something important. A case does not expire. A victim does not become forgotten. And a question does not stop mattering simply because years pass. Technology will continue changing. New methods will emerge. New discoveries will be made. And somewhere another cold case file may be waiting for the same moment. The moment when the impossible becomes possible. For Laura Bennett, that moment finally arrived. The highway where her story began is still there. Cars still travel across the same landscape. The desert wind still moves across the open land. But the silence feels different now. Because silence was once the enemy. Now it is simply the space where the truth waited. For 30 years, the case remained a mystery. A question without an answer. A story without an ending. But the truth was never gone. It was hidden, protected, waiting beneath layers of time. And eventually, it came back. The world called it a cold case solved. But for those who loved Laura, it was something more.
It was a promise kept.
A name remembered. A life finally acknowledged. The desert kept its secret for decades. But secrets do not last forever. Evidence does not forget. And justice, even when delayed, can still find its way home.